I believe it's going to be sometime in January, another James Connolly Forum, which will feature Spencer Rapone, who was the commie cadet that held up the "Communism Will Win" sign and got kicked out of the Army for it. So that'll be sometime in January. So, again, my name's Adam Peltier. I'm here for a couple different reasons. I'm a federal employee that I'm employed by the Social Security Administration and a union representative for AFGE 3343, the locals grievance vice president. I'm also a veteran. A lot of missed haircuts ago, I was an enlisted Marine from 2002 to 2006 on active duty. Deployed once right at the beginning of the Iraq War and got lucky. There was only the one deployment, and I spent the rest of the time kind of on a instructor duty training reservists. I'm here today, I think primarily because of one instance back sometime earlier in this year. We had a labor breakfast over in Albany, and this congressional district's elected official, Mr. Paul Tonko, showed up a short time after he had voted in favor of the VA Mission Act, which I will let Ms. Gordon talk about the specifics of that. In essence, I looked at it as a backdoor way to privatize the VA. Mr. Tonko didn't necessarily agree, and Mr. Flanders happened to catch a picture of me presenting Mr. Tonko with one of Suzanne's other books, which the title is
Battle for Veterans Healthcare.
Battle for Veterans. Yep. I did invite a staffer of his to come here tonight, but I don't see her. I'm sure she had a scheduling conflict. So that was the event that kind of put me in this place today, which was sort of an impulsive act. I try not to act impulsively. I usually try to be more cold and calculating, but the moment was right at that time. Some of the other things that I've been up to since then is, and there's going to be some common threads, back in May of 2018, Trump signed some executive orders that were designed to essentially eviscerate the federal public sector unions through a bunch of various means. I did not agree with a lot of what was happening, so I wrote all over the windows at the place where I work. They kicked me out for a long time. Since back, one of the things that was frustrating throughout that is although I do have more, I guess, rights than a lot of other employees, I'm a federal unionized employee, the union itself on the higher, more bureaucratic levels did not exactly come rushing to my defense as much as I would have liked them to. There was a lot of people that thought that what I had done was inappropriate, or why would you do something like that? And part of the answer was because the higher components weren't doing very much about it other than filing a lawsuit, which they won. But even with that, the federal agencies are still going crazy trying to bust the unions. Just within the last couple weeks, the VA announced that it was going to bar or restrict Veterans of Affairs employees who are RNs from representing employees in their capacity at work. So the reason that the government is saying that they're going to do that is because there's such an operational need for these employees to be doing RN positions that they don't have time to allow them to represent employees. And anybody in here, I'm sure there's a number of us who are union representatives, it is always better, at least I think, to have a representative who is also employed in the same capacity. It's going to be hard for a staff level representative to be able to represent an employee if they don't know anything about the job. So that's still going on. And the funny thing about all that is the biggest reason that the agency is even able to cite that need is because they and Congress have systematically understaffed and underfunded federal agencies across the board. So it's a problem that the government and the elected officials created, and now they are trying to solve that problem by attacking some of the same people who brought these things to light. The incident a number of years ago in Phoenix, where the headlines talked about 40 dead veterans died waiting for service, that started this whole process where rather than the government addressing the issue of understaffing and secret calendars, they just started to attack the whistleblowers. There's actually separate rules for VA employees, even under the federal service, that don't exist elsewhere. I think at present, right now, the union and other individuals like Ms. Gordon have been able to show that there's about, I think, 47,000 vacancies across the VA right now. So removing approximately 430 from their union capacity positions is not going to solve something that needs almost 50,000 more employees. So that's just an example of the government. Even after they lost in court, they just retooled how they wanted to come after the union, and they're doing so again at present. And in my union capacity, I work for an agency where approximately 10,000 people every year die waiting for disability determinations. So it will only probably be a matter of time before some bean-counting bureaucrat in central office decides that what they really need to do to solve the problem is to stop people like me from being able to represent other employees. We'll see, how that happens, but I do expect that the government and the Trump administration will do whatever it can to try and further erode whatever exists still of the federal public sector union employees. I don't know what the answers are to solve a lot of these problems. I don't think privatizing the VA through the VA mission is going to actually help anything. There are a lot of people with a lot of different ideas. I think that the best thing that they could do in both fronts, both with the VA and Social Security, is to adequately fund the agencies so that the staffing shortfalls don't exist. There's one other thing I think would be really effective. It just, every time I bring it up, people tell me I'm crazy. I think that Congress needs to amend the 5 USC 71, it's colloquially, however you say it, known as the statute, which covers how federal employees will deal with unions. And right now, as many of you may or may not know, it's illegal for someone like me to advocate for a strike of federal employees, organize a slowdown, or a work stoppage. And the reason that's illegal is because of the language in 5 USC 71. So, to fix it partially, one thing that they could do is just strike the anti-strike clause from that law. There are a lot of people that may think that there are some jobs that are quote-unquote too important to allow employees to go on strike, advocate slowdowns or work stoppages. But if the job is too important that someone could be led to believe that, then the job should be fully staffed and adequately supported. I don't know if that'll ever get off the ground. I will be running it by Paul Tonko's office. He does live in or represent one of the most union dense districts in the United States. So we will see how that goes. I don't have any expectations that that'll become law anytime soon, but I do think that enabling federal employees to use some of the more or most effective tactics that unions actually have would go a long way towards fixing a lot of these problems. And now I'm just going to read the James Connolly introduction. For those of you that may not know, James Connolly came to the United States in 1902, moved to Troy in 1903. He lived at 96 Ingalls Avenue, just a few blocks from where we are right now. He worked for the Metropolitan Insurance Company until a recession caused the firm to falter. While he was here, he was active in the Socialist Labor Party, where he engaged in notable dispute with its leader, Daniel DeLeon, over the utility of fighting for wage increases. If anybody's looking to get more details on that, there's a really good breakdown on, I think it's Marxist.org. You can find all the back and forth correspondence between DeLeon and James Connolly. James Connolly was a supporter of a strike by women workers in Troy. And as most of you probably know, when he returned to Ireland, he played a leading role in great labor lockout conflicts, including the Dublin lockout of 1913. And he also led the Irish Citizen Army in its uprising against British rule in 1916. And for his efforts, he ended up being executed for his efforts. And I think with that, I'll hand it over to Ms. Gordon.
Thank you so much. I'm really honored to be here with Adam and all of you, and I want to thank John and Nancy and all my friends, Andy Coates and Fred and Melanie and Sean, for coming out on a not very nice night. Left my northeastern roots and become a Californian, and have become a wimp. Except I'm glad to be here because at least here we can breathe as opposed to where I live. So I want to talk to you for a little while and then open it up about the VA. I suppose a lot of you know how the VA works, but a lot of you might not because not that many people do. So I'm going to just start with why I think the VA is so important and why we have to defend it. And I might read something from my book. And then I just want to talk to you about the privatization moves that are afoot now that Adam was talking about, and encourage more of you, every single one of you, to appear at Gilbrand or Tonko or whoever's office to try to talk to them about this, even if you're not a veteran. How many people in the room are veterans, aside from Adam? Okay, so I want to start by saying that I started out, I'm a healthcare journalist. I've been writing about healthcare for like 30-something years. And I think like most people, I didn't really know much about the VA. I'm not a veteran. Nobody in my family, close family, is a veteran. My daughter, after I started writing my book, who's a nurse practitioner, worked at the VA for a year, but nobody I knew had worked at the VA. I sort of probably didn't pay much attention to stories about VA healthcare, good or bad, in the papers, because particularly if they were good, that didn't really apply to me. After all, I'm not a veteran, and I didn't really understand that the VA actually helps people who aren't veterans as well as veterans. And when I started, I've been writing about healthcare for 30-something years, and mostly about nursing, healthcare systems. I edited a book series at Cornell University Press on culture and politics of healthcare work. And I got my first glimpse of the VA about, I don't know how many years ago, 12 years ago, when I was asked to do some consulting. I read a lot about patient safety and teamwork at the VA in Palo Alto and around teamwork. And I was really surprised when I started hanging out at the VA at how accountable the system was. That was the thing that first impressed me. Because if Johnny didn't get his PT on time, or Billy didn't get his psychology appointments, or somebody was unhappy with something, and I was hanging out on what their polytrauma unit, which polytrauma in the VA is a lot of people who've had strokes, many people have strokes, amputations, combination of trauma, PTSD, traumatic brain injury, amputation, etc. The VA has a very elaborated system of polytrauma, and they have these big polytrauma centers, and then where people go in their residential programs, and after they've had a big trauma and they've been stabilized in either a VA hospital or another hospital, then they'll be sent there for their rehabilitation. And what's interesting, actually, people need to know about, is the military hospitals do not have rehabilitation services. So they have memorandums of understanding with the VA, and so VA facilities, blind rehab, spinal cord injury, polytrauma, will have active duty military service members who've had, a trauma in there because it's not cost effective for the two systems to have replicative services, and so the VA has way better services, so they have those services. And so what I discovered when I was at this polytrauma unit was, the first thing that surprised me about the VA was that, Johnny didn't get his PT, and Mommy and Daddy called their congressman. And their congressman came in and did what's called a congressional and investigated. And you see these investigations, the results of these investigations in the paper, and then they do something about it, right? The VA has its own Office of Inspector General that does oversight and reports. They have Congress, etc. It is an extremely accountable and transparent system. Now, even if they try to hide something, it usually doesn't work. So the Phoenix scandal that everybody heard about was a result of actually a whistleblower, but then it turned into a whole accountability thing, and it was very transparent. And one of the reasons why you hear these negative stories in the media is because it's transparent. If Albany Med or New York Langone or Harvard or Brigham and Women or whatever has a problem, you will often not hear about it, because if it results in a suit, it has to be really big and have made the papers, but otherwise, if somebody, sues the doc or sues the hospital, there's a non-disclosure agreement. If there's a settlement, and you never hear about it, and we never learn from it. And the kinds of things that are reported in the VA, and Andy, I think, can speak to that, happen in hospitals all over the country every day, but we just don't know about them. Right, there was a big story in USA Today about nursing home care. Nursing homes are one of the biggest scandals, for-profit nursing homes in the country, but do we hear about that? Not that often, but some little tiny nursing home in the VA system has a problem, and it's on the front page of a newspaper. I got a call one time from somebody in a congressional office in Vermont, because the Burlington Free Press had a story about 8-month waits at UVM, University of Vermont Medical Center, for sleep apnea studies. And she said, if this happened in a VA, it would be on the front page of the New York Times, right? But who's reporting on that in a national publication? So the VA is very transparent and accountable. And it is also very, it's got this lumbering bureaucracy image, but it's actually remarkably flexible and responsive, because they change things. And they innovate at the national level, and because it's a system, the innovations go to the local level, and then there are local level experiments that go national, and I describe a lot of them in my book. The VA, how many of you know that the VA is the largest? It is the largest healthcare system in the United States. It has 1,700 facilities of care, 300,000 employees, 100,000 of whom are veterans. Adam doesn't work at VA, but they give preferential hiring to veterans and give a lot of hiring to disabled veterans.
And are they all unionized also too, Suzanne?
They are pretty much wall to wall, although that's one of the reasons why they're being attacked. You know, the VA is the only publicly funded, fully integrated healthcare system in the country. And what do I mean by that? This is extremely important for those people who are advocates of healthcare reform of a national health system. So the VA is a national system, so Adam, who is enrolled in the VA, can leave, you know, Albany and move to Seattle, and he can just then, he has his card, which he showed me. He takes his VA card and he goes to the Seattle VA or wherever VA he wants. And he has, there's an electronic medical record that will follow Adam, so it will, if it works well, and it doesn't always work well, there are glitches, theoretically, he gets in, you know, and his record follows him, unlike my medical record that took 5 months to get from Boston to San Francisco when I moved and asked my doctor, private sector doctor, lovely man, to send it, you know. Guess what? And they just type it in, you know. They were the pioneers in creating electronic medical records. This is all being privatized now, but okay, so that's one level of integration. A more important level of integration is the care is integrated. Now, most of us who aren't in the VA never have or never will experience integrated care. What we experience is disintegrated care.
Symptomatic.
It's disintegrated even if it's symptomatic. So essentially, you will go to your primary care doc, you say you're, you know, anxious, you're depressed, or whatever. They may refer you to a psychologist or licensed clinical social worker. You're having trouble losing weight, they might look up online to a dietitian or nutritionist who they never met and find out if their insurance covers that. Of course, that's important, right? And then they will give you a referral. They might write a cryptic note to that person in a chart, you know, and send it to them, right? But they probably don't share the chart with them, so God knows how the note gets to them, right? Because people don't, you know, they're not. And you may or may not go to the nutritionist or to the social worker or to the psychologist, or you may or may not make the appointment, or you may or may not show up at the appointment. In the VA in primary care, I've been there and watched them. You know, I've sat in on these exams. A veteran will tell his or her primary care doc or nurse practitioner, I'm feeling this way or that way, and she or he will walk that veteran down the hall to the psychologist or psychiatric nurse practitioner's office and in a warm handoff. They call it a warm handoff. And that veteran will begin chatting with the psychologist, the nutritionist, the pharmacist, the social worker, etc. So the likelihood of them following up with behavioral health or mental health care is extremely high. And this model was developed in White River Junction, Vermont, a long time ago, and then it became so successful in this one place that it went national. So that it's a very, you know, when you have a healthcare system, as opposed to a disintegrated series of entrepreneurial enterprises, you can do a lot of, I call it, it's like a, I don't know how you say dual carriageway. They say in England dual carriageway. It's like a innovation superhighway, you know, that goes in both directions, from the local to the national. So basically with this integration, this primary care mental health integration and the, you know, Andy could speak to this. Andy is my friend who's a hospitalist and an internist. A lot of your patients, a lot of us, you know, have mental health issues, right? Or behavioral health issues. And it's almost impossible to integrate them in a private healthcare system like this. I had a friend who, my dear friend she is a burnt out primary care doc. She retired way early, like so many primary care docs do in America, because of just not being able to deal with our cockamamie healthcare system. But she was taking care of a mutual friend who was morbidly obese and needed nutritional help, right? Needed help with her diet and so forth. And, you know, she had she didn't know any nutritionists, right? There was nobody in her practice, even though how many of her patients were obese, right? Or needed to lose weight. And she, you know, could never get our friend to go get help. And, you know, 2 years later, she died in her kitchen unloading her grocery bags full of crap. Now, who knows if she'd gone to the VA, if she would have gotten better. I mean, there's no guarantee. But you have integrated care. Chronic pain for veterans. Veterans have a lot of chronic pain issues, right, Adam? It's really good for you to be lugging when you're 18, you know, these 70-pound packs on your back, and God only knows what you're doing with them on your back. I mean, you're not just like strolling, right? And veterans have terrible chronic pain, muscular, you know, neck, feet, knee injuries, serious chronic pain problems. I don't know if you experienced this in the Marines, but a lot of the veterans I've interviewed said that the military gave out opiates like candy, you know, because the idea is it's like football players, right? You get injured, you want to get back. Another big problem, I'd love to hear Adam's view about this, but I've heard this over and over and over again. And this is extremely important to know if you're looking at the headlines where they, you know, talk about veteran suicide and stuff like that, is particularly the guys, but even the women who go into the military probably come from backgrounds where it's not so cool to say you need help, you know, and particularly if it's a mental health issue. In the military, it's really frowned upon to go to the medic, to go to the doctor, even for a physical problem, but for a mental health problem, would you say that?
That's very accurate, especially if it was a mental health concern. It was disincentivized, mostly by ridicule.
Yeah.
I would argue, yeah.
Yeah, like what? What would they?
Just, you know, so-and-so is a head case, or can't handle it, whatever the issue was perceived as weakness, and maybe the service wasn't for those people.
Yeah.
How it was handled or treated.
Right. So for 30%, you know, 30% of veterans have PTSD, right? So I mean, that's kind of a lot of people in the service who can't handle it, and the service. So it's really a problem because the other thing that people need to know about the VHA. Okay, so actually, the VA, when we talk about the VA, we're referring to the Department of Veterans Affairs. The VA is made up of 3 agencies. The National Cemetery Administration, that's not what they're arguing about when we're talking about privatization. I mean, I'm sure they would like to privatize that, but you know. Then there's the Veterans Benefit Administration, the VBA, and that administers benefits like the GI Bill, health care, home loans, blah, blah, blah. Chronically underfunded and understaffed, like Social Security, right? Backlogs, et cetera. And then there's the VHA, the Veterans Health Administration, which is the biggest agency in the department. And you cannot be get access to Veterans Health Administration unless you have a service-connected problem and/or low income, or were post 9/11 vet, you can get 5 years and then probably more. And then there were periods in our history where eligibility changed, and so Vietnam vets or something like that. But essentially, the Veterans Health Administration is a healthcare system that cherry picks the sickest, oldest, and poorest veterans. No healthcare system says you can't get in if you're healthy or wealthy, right? I mean, and so they have excellent outcomes at way lower cost for the sickest, poorest, and oldest patients in the country, for very complex patients. Veterans have, another thing you need to know is that veterans have very specific problems. This was, you know, I think if before I had started writing about this, I would have thought, well, you know, why can't they just go anywhere, right? I mean, any doc should be able to take care of a veteran, right? But these people have serious, complex problems, and it's really what we call in healthcare kind of a population health issue. This is, you know, in healthcare they talk about not just dealing now with individuals, with populations, and this is a population with very specific problems. Some of the problems are psychological, behavioral, some of the problems are physical, a lot of them are together. So veterans have more chronic pain, more mental health problems, substance abuse problems, higher risk for suicide, I said chronic pain, serious chronic pain problems, and then a whole bunch of different exposures. And one of the things that is really interesting in the VHA is they have a military, a little pamphlet that they give out about military, how to take a military health history. And this is like two-sided. And it is extremely extensive because it asks about things like housing and vocation and employment and how's your marriage and blah, blah, blah. It asks about your mental health. But it also, every war and conflict has a specific set of exposures, toxic exposures, bacterial and viral exposures. I mean, stuff I can't even pronounce, you know, depending on what conflict you were in. And then just being in the military. You don't have to leave the United States, has a whole bunch of problems. I mean, does anybody know what the #1 reason why veterans go to the VA is? Can you guess?
Stress.
What?
Stress.
Tinnitus. Because,
What? Oh,
tinnitus.
The
Ringing in your ear because,
That's what my dad was.
yeah, because every single branch of the service has toxic noise exposures. Think about it. Explosions in basic training, right? Did you do explosions in boot camp?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Shoot machine guns.
Shooting machine guns. You know, kind of like Air Force engines, Navy boats that are essentially boomboxes, right? So people have, that's the #1 reason why they go to the VA, hearing loss and tinnitus. And then there are all these other exposures, and it's really interesting. This is kind of an extremely important thing to know because when you talk about privatization, right, and sending veterans out to the private sector, you have to ask the question, you know, would a private sector doc, primary care doc, or anybody, you know, be able to recognize the difference between regular prostate cancer and Agent Orange related prostate cancer, diabetes and Agent Orange, a respiratory problem and respiratory problems from burn pits, right? It's kind of important to know about this stuff because you don't know how to treat it if you don't know it. And also they won't record these problems and collect data about them and know about the prevalence of them if they're not, if they don't have a stable population in the same system. So how did they know about Agent Orange? They knew because, you know, I mean, it took them a long time to recognize Agent Orange, but they wouldn't have ever done anything about it, Congress, if they didn't have lots and lots and lots of veterans reporting these problems and then fighting about it. Same thing with PTSD. I described one of the pioneers in PTSD care in the national, well, what became the National Center for PTSD, who was a psychologist in the VA in Boston, and, you know, kept hearing seen these vets who were diagnosed with depression or alcohol abuse or whatever, and he kept hearing the stories of these vets, and they were all the same, and he thought, wait a minute, the alcohol abuse or depression is not the diagnosis, it's a result of the fact that they have this thing which they then call PTSD, which, you know, we've known about in wars forever, shell shock, battle fatigue, blah, blah, blah. And now they have these national centers, they have trainings in evidence-based practice, et cetera. Same thing is true of military sexual trauma and all these exposures. And veterans also have very specific adjustment problems. I mean, you go into the service when you're 18 and you don't, you know, have to think about a lot of stuff, right? That, you know, you'd have to think about if you went to college or you went to work. You get out when you're, you know, 22 or 40 or whatever, and then suddenly you're back in civilian life. And you've also sort of been socialized to think that civilians aren't as good as you. I don't know if you had that, but I hear veteran after veteran saying, you know, there's no consequences for people in civilian life. You know, in the Army, the Navy, the Marines, there's consequences for your actions. You know, it's really interesting. Veterans are also interestingly hard on each other, really tough on each other. I mean, there's a kind of a, I had a friend who's a Vietnam vet who had, you know, PTSD, the whole 9 yards, and who said, a lot of us don't want to go to VAs because, you know, we'll encounter these wannabes in the waiting room. And so he was talking about Vietnam vets who weren't in the same shit that he was in, weren't in the shit, you know. So it's interesting because we're actually more, you know, thank you for your service-y and kind of welcoming to veterans than they are sometimes to each other. I don't know if you've heard that, Anna, but.
That's definitely true. There's even nicknames for people who aren't infantry, call them pogues, personnel other than grunts, and there's a whole hierarchy of shaming of different occupations within the Marine Corps. Yeah, it's like supply clerks are bottom of the barrel.
No, it's pretty incredible, you know, because, I mean, I have a friend who is a Vietnam vet who is basically never been able, he flew on the B-51s, B-51s? 52s, right, B-52s, sorry. And, you know, they would bring the supplies in and the dead bodies out. And he has PTSD as a result of that, and has essentially pretty much never left his room. I mean, he had a job, but, you know, became an alcoholic. But he was never in the shit, according to some of my other friends who were in the shit, you know. So he would be, if he talked about Vietnam, he would be a wannabe, right? And it's, but you have to know about this culture in order to effectively treat people. I describe in here a program for Iraq and Afghanistan vets who have PTSD and traumatic brain injuries, residential program. And I sat in on hung out with these guys for a week, and they were giving a really hard time to another vet who was in the program who hadn't left his room for 2 weeks since entering, and he hadn't been in the shit, you know, but he had terrible problems, and the psychologist had to, you know, really basically say that you can't do that. That will not go here. Everybody has to feel safe. You know, we're not going to do that to each other, right? We're not going to play that game. So the VA has, the Veterans Health Administration has a huge system that only sees veterans, right? And so kind of like knows about their problems. Has developed all kinds of treatments in every single area, homelessness, veterans justice, has Veterans Court program that there was actually started in Buffalo, New York, 156 veterans courts to keep veterans out of jail and prison. I visited some of them, PTSD to substance abuse to spinal cord injury to et cetera. And it has just this huge complex system with hundreds and hundreds of different programs. And it's very effective. Thousands of studies have shown that the VA delivers equal care that's equal or superior to the private sector. Mental health care, I would argue that the VA has the only functioning mental health system in this country. Has just, I mean, I've never seen such dedicated caregivers, doctors, nurses. They all work on salary, so they have no incentive to overtreat, because if an oncologist sends a patient into palliative care or hospice, they don't lose revenue. It's not it's a revenue neutral decision.
It's done for the right reasons, you mean?
Yes. Pardon me?
It's done for the right reasons.
It's done for the right reason. I once heard a friend of mine who's actually married to a vet told me a story of going to a nursing home and hearing another patient's daughter saying she wanted to be moved to hospice, and the primary care doc said, but then I won't be able to bill for her. You know, because he loses her as patient, he loses a revenue stream. So this amazing system, and I'd be glad to answer questions about it in more detail, is now under attack. It's been under attack since the Phoenix quote-unquote wait time scandal, when private sector performance standards were imposed on VA doctors. They were completely unrealistic. You had to get an appointment within 14 days of calling. And they did game the system in places like Phoenix. Adam mentioned 40 dead. That was what the right wing, the Koch brothers funded Concerned Veterans for America was putting out. Actually, at some point they said 300. The Inspector General of the VA did a report, and they found 6 people had died in Phoenix, but they were never able to establish whether it was because they were waiting for care or while they were waiting for care. And that's kind of important, because because most of us, when we die, will have had some kind of appointment that we miss because we died. I mean, you know, so most of us die while waiting for some kind of care. You know, like we make an appointment with our doctor and, you know, have a cardiac arrest or, you know, whatever. That's not because. There's a big difference. This has been overblown. The corporate media has largely followed and disseminated the Koch brothers. Everybody knows, so the Koch brothers are the billionaire radical libertarians who hate democracy and want to destroy government, and they really don't care about health care. They actually do. They care, I mean, they don't care about health care because they have a financial stake in it, because they're in the energy industries, right? They don't have health care companies. But they have an ideological commitment, deep ideological commitment against democracy, against any public provision of care, and against government. And they have taken this opportunity that was presented to them by Phoenix and run with it. And they have really been hammering in Congress and in the media and promoting these stories. And they have been very successful with even like CNN, USA Today, the New York Times, which has run terrible stories about the VA consistently, and never anymore runs positive stories about all the things the VA does that we need to know about, because they are models. I mean, how many of you know, for example, that the VA is the biggest research powerhouse in the nation? It's because it has a large, stable population, right? I mean, you have 9 million people who are sort of in the VA from discharge to grave, and you want a stable big population to do big data research, right? Prostate Cancer Foundation, which is actually funded in large part by the Koch brothers, gave, because they all have prostate cancer, all four of them. And you know, these rich people, they like to give to charity that helps them, right? The opera, you know, I mean, how many of us go to the opera? I mean, some of us go to the opera, but you know, the museums and things like that, they like, and then they get to have their name on it, right? Nobody, you know, writes a front page story because Mark Zuckerberg pays his taxes. You know, Mark Zuckerberg paid his taxes today. But they do when Mark Zuckerberg gives $75 million to San Francisco General Hospital, which he then insists on renaming Zuckerberg. You know, et cetera. And spends, you know, $1 million making the San Francisco Chronicle do a 14-page supplement on the Zuckerberg hospital. So the VA is now being attacked. Adam talked about the Mission Act, which a lot of Democrats supported. This is an act that will allow more and more veterans to go to private sector care. It's unfunded, so every dollar that comes out of, that goes to private sector care for more expensive care will come out of the VA budget. It will set up a commission in 2020 that President Trump can appoint, which will be like a BRAC commission, a base closing commission, which will look at VA facilities and decide which ones are underutilized, and then will recommend closing them. Congress cannot vote on each individual decision. It has to vote up or down on the whole package. So your individual congressperson can't say, wait a minute, you know, the Albany VA or the New York City VA should not be closed if they recommend it. And this is a setup because Trump wants 60 or 70% of veterans to get care in the private sector. Well, if they get care in the private sector, then they're underutilizing the VA, right? And so these facilities will be underutilized, and in 5 years, they'll look at them and say, oh my goodness,
We don't need them.
we don't need them. And, you know, you also need volume to assure quality. Right, you have to have patient volume to assure quality, because you don't want to go to a cardiologist for open heart surgery who's only done 10 operations this year. You want to go to a cardiologist doing open heart surgery who's done, what, hundreds, thousands, whatever, you know. So you start sending people out to the private sector, all these centers for excellence will lose volume, people will lose skills, people won't want to work for the VA. You have attacks in the media on VA staff. John Boehner, wonderful guy, former speaker, sat 2 weeks ago on the floor of the Cleveland Clinic auditorium with the Cleveland Clinic CEO by his side, and he said no real doctor would work for the VA. So all the people you represent who are real doctors, nurses, psychologists, they're not really real, you know, there's no real doctor, nurse, psychologist would want to work for the VA. So I would love to chat with folks about, I have these stickers, I have one on my computer and 2 on my car, and I'm not a veteran. And I would encourage everybody to put one on their car or one on their computer, because it is our VA. It is our healthcare system. Teaches 70% of American doctors in training. You know, most American psychologists, nurses, etc. Largest nursing workforce in the country, has the biggest research, and develops models of clinical care that would help us all. For those of us who are concerned about having a national health system, that's a system, not just a payer. Medicare is a payer, it's not a system, right? So I personally think it should be VA for all, not Medicare for all. I'm not going to get very far with that idea. But that's the reason why the Koch brothers are funding groups like the Pacific, like Concerned Veterans for America and Pacific Research Institute, because they want to they want to tarnish the reputation of the VA and use it as a poster child for why national health care can't work in America and how it'll kill you. I just want to leave you with one stat, because I think it's important. The RAND Corporation did a study of New York State healthcare providers, doctors, NPs, mental health providers, nurse practitioners, PTs, physical therapists, and occupational therapists. It developed 7 criteria for whether they were competent and capable of caring for veterans. Guess how many percent of those providers were under the RAND criteria, ready to serve, as they said? Guess how many percent? No, give me a
15.
15. Andy? 2.
Oh my God.
2%.
Oh, Lord.
2%. They want to send veterans into a system in which 2% of providers were competent. The majority of providers had no knowledge of military culture or the specific problems of veterans. And what was even scarier was when asked if they wanted to learn, the majority said no. So they would be happy to do their bit, happy to take your money and my money, happy to have veterans sit in their office, and they didn't want to learn about their specific problems. Well, why would they? I mean, if you have a patient panel, if you're a primary care doctor and you have a patient panel of 3,400 or 2,100 patients and you have 100 veterans, does it make any sense for you to spend hours trying to learn about veterans? I'm going to conclude with this one story and then we can open it up. I have a friend who's a Vietnam vet. Very typical history, had PTSD, finally went to the VA to get help, became okay, established himself, had a very, a nice business, had private sector health care, retired. Like many Vietnam vets or people with PTSD, when they're idle and they're not doing anything, it comes back. So he goes to his PCP, his primary care provider, and he says, I'm having nightmares and insomnia. And the guy prescribes Ambien, which I think is actually contraindicated with PTSD. Doesn't diagnose PTSD, doesn't even know he's a veteran, because my friend has never said he's a veteran, because they never ask. That's not a question that they ask. And he wasn't a professional veteran, so, he was this was like 50 years ago. Finally, he goes to the VA and gets treated. But, I mean, I could have diagnosed PTSD knowing he was a Vietnam vet and knowing the course of this. But this is what will happen to veterans if we do not object as citizens. Every single one of us can call our congresspeople. These new Democrats have got to stop this juggernaut. And I want Adam and some of you to go back to Tongo and, Gillibrand and so forth to say we can't have this. And by the way, any of us, and I'm sure everybody in this room, wants a single payer or some kind of national health system. If they can kill the VA, we have no chance. I mean, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, but, we have destroyed an excellent homegrown model that should be something that we all enjoy. I will never get the kind of care that Adam gets at the VA. And we have the best health insurance around because they don't know how to do it, right? So I'd love to open it to discussion and let's, I don't know, have a strategy session, or what can we do about this? How do people feel about what I've just talked about and so forth? Yes?
Sorry, I must have missed it. Did you say that the BRAC Commission legislation has actually been passed already for its meeting?
In the Mission Act, there is a section setting up a commission.
Has that been passed?
Yes, that's part of the Mission Act.
Okay.
And tragically, the Veteran Services organizations went along with this dreadful legislation. They're now having buyer's remorse because they bought them off with what's called the Caregiver Support Program. There's a program that was established for post 9/11 vets where severely disabled vets, their family members can be paid to stay home with them, get health insurance, contributions, and training. But that was limited to 9/11 vets, post 9/11 vets, and these VSOs, the Veteran Service Organizations, VSOs, Veteran Service Organizations, were promised expansion of the caregiver support program to veterans of all ages. The problem is it's not funded. So there's, not gonna be money to do the expansion, so it will just pit veterans against veterans. So, anybody who's, in a VSO of any kind, we only have one vet here, should be saying to the Legion or Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America or any group, Veterans for Peace is really the only group that is working with AFGE, the National Nurses Union, SEIU, some other unions to fight this. But the traditional VSOs are kind of waking up to the fact that they may just have made a big mistake, They have a history of making big mistakes, particularly the Legion and the VFW. But so, yes. Other questions or comments? Patty?
Are we,
Pat?
that's okay. Are we tasked to go to our, congressperson, senator, or whatever, and ask them to retract this? Is that what we're?
So, if you were to call your congressman or senator, I would say the Mission Act, which they probably voted for, undoubtedly they did. Gillibrand voted for it, so did Tom.
Yeah.
You now have a chance to repent or to remedy your significant mistake. And I probably wouldn't say that. I would say you really need to make sure that the access standards are not going against the intent of the law, which was to allow some veterans, not all veterans, to get care in the private sector. So the access standards, which the Secretary is now developing, this is a very important issue, and for example, one of the things they're considering is using drive time as an access standard. So any vet who has to drive more than 30 minutes for a primary care or behavioral health appointment, or more than 60 minutes for a specialty care appointment, would be eligible for care in the private sector and would be pushed into the private sector. That is essentially everybody, because who doesn't have to drive for 30 or 60 minutes to an appointment? So one of the things you would ask for is these access standards have to be based on quality. If the VA doesn't deliver high quality service, and the private sector does, and so that means they have to have quality metrics which are non-existent that compare the VA to the private sector for tons of different things. So you have to say to them, we want access standards that don't open the floodgates. And then the other thing is that it has to be funded through mandatory funds. The caps, the spending caps have to be elevated, and the money to pay for private sector care can't come out of the VHA budget. So those are the two things that you want to focus on. Yes. Fred?
John, I think I was first.
Oh, John, sorry.
Yeah, a couple things. Could you talk about what's TRICARE, which as I understand is a veterans program, and how is that different from the VHA? And what are the similarities and differences between the VHA and the British National Health Service, and which is also under assault? And are there similarities in the privatization approaches in the two systems?
Yes, those are great questions. So TRICARE is private insurance. It's like Blue Cross or something. It's for people who've mostly been for people who are in the military now, or who were mostly career, and it's a payer. It's an insurance company payer, and it's not a provider of care. The VA is a payer and a provider, so that's why it can do good things. And there are all kinds of problems with TRICARE, like regular insurance, and there have been a lot of horrible scandals many years ago in the 90s. Do people know, people know Tenet, right? Tenet Healthcare, second largest for-profit corporation. Tenet is called Tenet because it used to be called National Medical Enterprises. And the reason why it's now called Tenet and not National NME is because in the 90s in Texas and the Southwest, they discovered that military families with were ripe for the picking, and they paid psychiatrists bounties to find people who didn't need to be hospitalized, but who had some odd little behavioral problem. And they hospitalized them, sometimes against their wills. They paid them bounties. And then when they milked them in their insurance, they kicked them out, and they often had problems they didn't have when they went in. It was a huge scandal. NME had to pay $396 million, the largest fraud payment in American history at that point. And that's why they changed their name. And this is going to happen now. I mean, it's already in the works. They're all these cockamamie, unproven mental health treatments. They have Trump started something called the Cover Commission. He put his pal Jake Leinenkugel, who is a beer, right-wing beer owner, knows nothing about healthcare, in charge of it. And they're looking at all kinds of quack mental health treatments. Some of them aren't quack, but many of them are. And Leinenkugel said, I don't really care if there's any scientific evidence. If it helped 6 people, if it made them feel better, we should pay for it. Well, I mean, I feel better when I take my opiates, and when I drink. And, I mean, it's just incredible. Your second question was the National Health Service. The VA is kind of like the National Health Service, sort of. It's everybody, they own the facilities, like the NHS, the doctors and everybody's on salary. And the same exact forces that are attacking the VA, the NHS are attacking the VA. Kaiser. They're trying to get into Britain, they're already there. Kaiser would love, to see the VA destroyed because they would like the money. They don't really want, some of the talk is, I don't want to get too in the weeds here, but some of the talk is, let's focus on foundational services, not understanding that the foundational service the VA provides is that it's a health system and a public health system, because it deals with what we call social determinants of health, housing, employment, et cetera, as well as doctor's appointments. If you listen to the hearings in Congress, John, most of the discussion is about doctor's appointments and treatments for, knee replacements. Because the private sector doesn't want homeless vets. The private sector doesn't want chronically mentally ill or managing,
Well, the private sector doesn't care if they're homeless. They don't want them in their clinic.
Right, yeah. The private sector isn't going to send, I described a scene here in my book where I was hanging around with a social worker, VA social worker in San Francisco, and we were going to Union Square and going up to homeless people, over there. And are you a veteran? Really? UCSF Medical Center is going to go to Union Square and try to find, go up to these guys lying on the street, haven't bathed in weeks. I can't tell you the stories of what, she was dealing with. We spent a week trying to find one vet in the West Portal neighborhood because they were worried about him. I got to be really good at, she taught me which alleys somebody's homeless might sleep in, and no, that alley, And we finally found the guy. Really? Steve?
Well, I think you had another hand, because Sean's here and SEIU Local 200 represents so many thousands of VA people in upstate New York. At some point, if you could mention the great work that many of their members do with the Veterans Crisis hotlines in upstate New York.
Yeah, so I have a whole chapter in here on suicide prevention, and I spent a day in Canandaigua where they have the Veterans Crisis line. And it is astonishing. You read in the New York Times, they've done reports on the failures of suicide prevention in the VA. They blamed it on the VA. and you know, the thing that's incredible is there's some veterans who do kill themselves in spite of everything. I mean, one of the guys who's kind of a poster child for the, 20 a day who killed themselves was a kid named Daniel Summers, who had I don't know how many tours in Iraq, 400 concussions. His brain was completely fried, and he himself said in his suicide note that he could not come back from this, and he kind of blamed the military, but his parents blamed the VA, because I think that it's hard when you encourage your kid to go into the military and then they kill themselves, and that's something that you see a lot, that they blame the VA for these I mean, you would never blame a pulmonologist, a lung doctor, for not being able to cure a person who had black lung disease because they worked in an unsafe mine. You wouldn't blame an oncologist, a cancer doctor, for not being able to cure end-stage pancreatic cancer. Some of these veterans have end-stage mental illness, and they try like hell to help them. But there's a stat, 20 veterans kill themselves a day. Of those 20, 14 have never been near a VA. Like Adam says, they were convinced that, you're a wimp, you should tough it out, you should be able to help yourself, blah, blah, blah. And the people in upstate New York and Canandaigua are amazing. They have this amazing crisis line. They work every day listening to these calls. I sat with them, and imagine what it's like for 8 hours a day to sit and listen to people on the phone telling you they're going to jump off a cliff, blow their brains out, kill their family that's in the next room, and you have to take responsibility for making sure that doesn't happen. And it's next, 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 next. Sean, do you?
Yeah, I mean, so my father is a retired Marine in his career, and the point about how they're discouraged from going to go to the medic or what have you, brought back. I'm thinking about it. I can count the number of times I saw my dad take Tylenol for a headache on a couple fingers. I never thought about it like that. And so I guess my question is like, the VA has these services for vets, right, who are who are, to your point, like end stage, like mental health issues. But what are they doing? How do they interface with the military itself to sort of, obviously, there's not going to be a social worker attached to every platoon. But like, how are they, but what are they doing to sort of mitigate these sort of outcomes?
Well, it's the DOD that has to do that, and the DOD is not doing a very good job. And I don't know, Adam, did you learn that you needed to have a paper trail of your injuries in order to get VA care when you were in the Marines?
So, in the few last weeks before you get off on active duty, at least in the Marine Corps, you're required to do these courses. And what it turns into is basically somebody who gets there and explains that these are your three options. You can, here's how you try to get the GI Bill, here is how you file for service-connected disability, and in most states you're eligible for unemployment. So it's, in some sense, I think that just the emphasis on the way that is presented to people, I think it gets a lot of people into the pipeline, but it also may get a lot of people more into some of those pipelines that maybe don't need to be there, if that makes sense, and that may to some extent be part of the problem with the claims backlog for service-connected disability. I could probably count on my hand the number of veterans I served with that aren't getting some sort of service-connected disability payment right now. It's not suggesting at all that they do not deserve it or qualify. They clearly do, otherwise they wouldn't be receiving it. But the overwhelming majority of veterans that I served with are in the VA, probably more the Veterans Benefit Administration part of it with the service-connected disability. So there is but it doesn't come until the end. It's like right at the end. Up until that is, do not go to the medic. If you think you're hurt, you need to drink more water and take Motrin. And that's the healthcare
What?
while on active duty.
And that's a real problem because in order to get service connection, to get into the VA, extensively, you need to have a paper trail that was, like I hurt my knee or my ankle. And the problem is, sometimes a kid who's 22 hurts his knee or ankle or her knee or ankle, and that's not gonna show up until they're 40 or 50, right? Because a lot of these musculoskeletal things, I've had vets who, I have right now a dossier from a veteran who was a parachutist, and it's kind of like right on your body, and his knees are messed up, and the comp and pen exam at the BVA, compensation and pension exam, says he probably had this undoubtedly has this because of his military service, but there's no paper trail. So to tell them when they're leaving is kind of like a little late. And the other thing, I don't know if you've had this, Adam, but I've been told this by so many veterans, is a lot of times veterans don't want to report medical problems or psychological problems when they're going to be separated from the service because they get put on a medical hold. And they can be kept for 2 or 3 months. And, after you've just been deployed 4 times in Iraq, and you're wanting to get out. And so what I was told by many veterans, we all lie, and that's also really bad. And I mean, that's a tricky problem to deal with, but you can sort of understand. I mean, the point is, you should not have to have a service-connected disability. You shouldn't have to prove. Steve, do you want to say something?
Yeah, I think, we have a very labor-oriented group here who I'm sure struggled for years with the shortcomings of the workers' comp system in New York State, right? Done a lot of lobbying about that. People have to view this system as a workers' comp system. And the problem with it being wrapped in the flag and wrapped in, this notion, well, you have to have been in combat to be covered by the VA, the 9 million people who do get the benefit of this health coverage, most never were in combat, but they have a job-related injury or illness. And they shouldn't be disqualified from getting this coverage because their problem manifests itself on the job before they were discharged. There's a couple of 100,000 people who really need to be in the VA, and they're not in it because of a little problem called bad paper. They have a dishonorable discharge.
No, they have an other than honorable.
Other than honorable discharge, and, but the kind of behavior that got them fired from the military, or could have gotten them fired from the phone company, had something to do with PTSD, or substance abuse, or the beginnings of brain damage. The difference between the workers' comp system and this system is that, you can be fired by the employer, but if you can still file a claim for black lung or for some job-related injury, and your status as an employee, doesn't prevent you from collecting benefits and possibly getting some medical care. But, in the VA, as long as people put it in this other category, we had a neighbor who was a Vietnam-era vet, spent tens of thousands of dollars on private health insurance over the years because he was a builder, an independent contractor. And in his 60s, he finally was persuaded by us, hey, you had a service-related injury, go apply, get covered by the VA, and almost as he reached the Medicare eligibility age, he's suddenly covered by the VA too, and he could have had 40 years worth of his medical bills paid for instead of paying out of pocket. So unless people think about this differently, a lot of people are going to be shortchanged, and unless we change this bad paper problem, a lot of people who really need the help, who got booted out unfairly, are going to continue to be deprived of VA benefits.
Right. So there's a so Fred, can I just explain this? So what Steve is talking about is that your ability to get into the VA is based on your discharge status, and there's a discharge category called other than honorable, and it means that essentially the military kicked you out because of some sort of behavioral problem. You got into fights, you got drunk. It's described in the book. It's applied very differently in the different services. And there's about 500,000 people who have bad paper, OTH discharges. And many of them acted out, you know, because they had a mental health problem and they really need care and they can't get it. And Trump has now said that, in an executive order, that the VA has to provide 90 days of mental health care, sometimes hospitalization, to people with serious mental illness because of these OTH, with bad paper. But the problem is it's, again, unfunded, understaffed. And, you know, if you have had serious mental health problems because of these, you know, longstanding issues, you need a hell of a lot more than 90 days. So this is something also you can say to your Congress could do this again, that, you know, Congress, this is another little thing, if you're going to talk to your Congress people, you know, why the hell are you not allowing people with other than honorable discharges to be eligible for VA care? Fred, sorry.
Yeah, just a couple things. I appreciated what Sean had to say. I worked with Local 200, 200D, the different variants of the 200 series for over a decade. And I represented workers at the Albany VA Hospital for much of that time, as well as other nursing homes. So I saw how about 20, 25 years ago, they started opening up nursing home beds to veterans.
Yes, yes.
And they started closing down the wings or not fully maintaining or enhancing the beds. And it's absolutely true. They set them there and they didn't give any additional training, because we were arguing on the other side that the new clientele, the nursing home, was disruptive because we have a lot of civilians here and the staff has no training to deal with the veterans. And we actually had veterans from the Julie Blair nursing home taking off in their wheelchairs trying to get back to the VA on the other side of town.
Oh my God.
And it was in the paper. So it was like, really, the veterans didn't like it. And I know that at the time, the Medicare rate was about $124 per day, but the VA rate was $163 a day. So that was the only reason that these nursing homes, and these were a lot of mom and shop nursing homes. The original owners were usually doctors, two do-gooders, plus it helped with their practice. And they started going out of business because they weren't terribly great business people. So whenever these nursing homes went to bankruptcy court during the Pataki administration, he would refer the bankrupt nursing homes to these investors from the city in different areas who wanted to come up and take advantage of a profit center for taking care of these people. And in fact, they tried to do that at our own Albany County nursing home 3 years ago, to privatize it with the same group of people, some of the same principals that did this tremendously tough union struggle at Julie Blair. So I see all these interconnections with the medical system. And it's a bottom line, the money, the privatization, it's a profit center. What I don't understand, and that's 10 years working with SEIU, is we have the VA system. And it was Kennedy that allowed them to be unionized with a decree when he was president. And that's how the whole SEIU developed in the area, because one of the bakers became the head of the union, a guy named Dave Patrick, out of the VA. And the VA, because it's a federal facility, is a right-to-work situation. So to get union membership up to 30–40%, we would sell dental insurance through the union benefit fund. Any way we could get people to join the union, we table. And then the VA had a VA council. And what I think has happened is the VA council is now servicing all the VAs.
Or the national, I don't know. No, I really don't know.
Because we used to service them in Albany, in the community. And what I'm seeing is that there's specialization even in the unions, and taking away from a local demographic, they're funneling different groups of workers and their unions through a channel that actually bypasses the local political, social demographics here in this area. I don't think it's Sean's decision, but there was always a fight for the VA council. They wanted to be independent. because they wanted to specialize. They're this special group of workers, which they are, but they're also healthcare workers. And right across the street, we had Albany Medical Center for years. So one of the questions I want to put to Andy is, what is the connection between the institutions, the Albany Medical Center and the VA? And then a larger dialogue that I think we should be thinking about is, how do we really get all healthcare workers working together? Because we had tremendous victory with NISDA at the VA, at Albany Medical Center, and people of color. Because in World War II, there was going to be a big strike of Afro-Americans, right? A. Philip Randolph, and he put Roosevelt on the spot, and Roosevelt basically opened up all branches of the service, including the VA, to black people as a result. So you have these sort of centers, these historical centers, but it seems to me everybody is sort of going their own way, and we could be much more effective at Canandaigua. I went on to Canandaigua 20 years ago for Save Our VAs then, when they had a rally there. We could be much more effective if all these healthcare unionists and other unions in the federal, state, and private sector could get more on the same page. So I don't know if people have any comments to that. I know maybe Andy could share if there's any interaction with the Med Center and the VA.
Well, the affiliation's an academic one, so what that means is that medical students and residents, doctors in training and medical students will, physicians assistant students, will rotate through both institutions and have
Okay, so the training piece is there.
Yeah, and that's the statistic. I think from the point of view of the medical profession, if you step back, coming out of the war, the Second World War, when there's conscription, virtually every doctor in the United States was in the military at some point, which changes the relationship of physicians to the military. I attended a fascinating talk by a military physician historian who talked about how he felt that this had changed the character of the democracy itself.
Yeah.
Because the Veterans Administration and the military were then separate from the medical community, which was more and more a profit-seeking corporate endeavor and less a people's endeavor. So your remarks made me think, though, I mean, if the VA is a conquest on behalf of working people, you alluded to it, but immediately before, during, and after the Second World War, there was a major rebellion by working people in their millions in this country. And the GI Bill and the Veterans Administration all gets rolling because the conservatives in Congress were afraid that the bonus expeditionary force would reform. And people that came out of World War I and never got remembered, never got their benefits, and then marched on Washington because here we are in a depression, and what are you going to do to recognize our service? You promised us a bonus payment. Give us the bonus payment. And they remembered that vividly in this context of hot rebellion. And if you think about the defeats that working people have had pretty consistently for several decades in this country, one of the things that, and this is, I'd be interested in your comment. You talk passionately about the Vietnam era veterans who are now reaching retirement age and facing some major health, chronic illness issues, acute illness issues. The World War II generation is at the very end of their lives and still not getting dignified care, in my opinion, as a generation. Meaning, it's a hodgepodge, maybe someone can drive from Saratoga into Albany to the VA clinic and get first-class care. That absolutely happens. But maybe more likely they get in an ambulance and end up at Saratoga Hospital and then transferred somewhere else, and it's this shuffling mess before they get to the doctors that actually know them at the VA. There's not really a system in the community. There's a system within the VA, but you have to be able to get into it. So I'm not pleased with the care of the elderly in general, and I think the VA is an extra level of support. So it's a conquest for working people that there would be some guarantee that if you were conscripted, if you served, I don't remember the plutocracy fighting the wars, that at least you'd be recognized later. And now, there's a poverty draft.
Yeah.
And the people who serve are the people who have the least power in the society. And so to kick the working class in the teeth by gutting the VA
Yes.
really makes a lot of sense from the point of view of the idea that there's a class enemy. And I think that it's interesting to think about what sources of strength the VA would have to defend itself. And you're making the evidence-based case that it's a better system, it's better quality, it's less costly, and in every way, integration makes more sense for people.
Steve, do you want to say something about Fred's question about the unions working together?
Yeah, well, I mean, Abby and I both worked for many years to try to build a bargaining, strike, mobilization coalition within first NINEX and then Bell Atlantic and now Verizon between IBW and CWA, and that was very difficult, and it was just two unions, and it was just within one region. I think the challenge for SEIU and for AFCHI, I think the largest of the three unions that have substantial VA membership, the California Nurses, National Nurses United being the other group, that claims about 20,000. So I don't know, AFCHI says 100,000, you guys have what, 6, 8? CNA, NNU claims 20. I mean, this is a big portion of the 300,000 employee workforce of this federal agency, even though it is open shop. And I'm sure this anti-privatization activity, based on our experience in the phone company, would be stronger if it was coordinated. But I know how difficult it is just getting two unions on the same page. Three is a different challenge, and you've got, regional areas of strength where the other unions aren't around, and there may be histories of conflict or tension or whatever. Suzanne met the other day with a great young guy, a veteran, who's now the Veterans Affairs Coordinator for the National AFL-CIO. He's very interested in trying to get labor councils and the National AFL more involved in supporting this nationwide, grassroots anti-VA privatization campaign that Veterans for Peace has picked up and adopted as a national priority. The labor councils can help, unions of any type, members who are veterans or VA users, but the key unions within the VA, maybe like the unions within the Red Cross, where SEIU and CWA and the Teamsters, everybody with a little piece of Red Cross somewhere finally got together, did some coordinated strike activity, including in upstate New York. Should be easier when you have big blocks of members in a huge federal bureaucracy like the VA, but it takes the unions being willing to work together, and AFCHI is a very mixed bag as a union, better in some places than others. It's another challenge.
Well, and I think even, CNA and SEIU, it's all uncoordinated, and it needs to be coordinated, And even if you just had activists getting together with VFP activists, or there's a great group of, there's the Vietnam Veterans Against the War, there's the Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans Against the War, there's a group in Chicago called Right to Heal. Our group called Veterans Healthcare Policy Institute. We need a kind of strategy session, quite frankly, with anybody who will come, and you have to be not, these unions can be mixed bags, but also, kind of like we've done this, as opposed to what can we all do together, because they're tooting their own horn or whatever. The same is true with the veteran service organizations, and I personally think, the Veterans for Peace has done amazing stuff. They are really the only veterans, they are going out there and they're picketing in front of hospitals, Stop Our VA. I can't get people to put these bloody things on their bloody cars. They're not just for God, if every person in this room would put one of these on their car, I can't tell you how many conversations I've had with people. I went to a tile store, And the guy was putting tile into my car, and he's like, oh, are you a veteran? And I'm like, no, I work with veterans, privatization, oh my God, really, you know, blah, blah, blah. He ended up writing a letter to his congressman, you know? VA employees, I mean, take these to the VA and get them to put them on their cars, you know? We have various versions of these, you know? The other thing that I think is really, really important for unions, and you probably are doing this, but one of the tragedies is that there is so much misunderstanding among government employees and VA staff of the Hatch Act. Terrible, terrible misunderstanding. They think they can't call a congressperson. They think they can't lobby. You know, they think they can't talk about politics in the workplace. And do people know what the Hatch Act is?
We know they can't write on windows.
We know that they run on windows. Okay.
And they can't run for public office.
But they can't go out and support a particular or run. They can. Sean? What's the strictures of the Hatch Act?
I mean, like I said, I don't really work with our.
Oh, okay.
The federal government.
Well, the Hatch Act is.
Yeah.
Oh, good.
So there is a lot of misunderstanding amongst my own local members. Even when I tell them you are allowed to post your support for candidate X on whatever social media, they don't believe me. The things that they're not allowed to do is campaign for candidate so-and-so while on duty. Yeah.
Right.
Or hold fundraisers or run in a partisan election.
Right.
But most of the guidance, and this is, in my opinion, a failure of the union, most of the guidance that's given to employees about the Hatch Act comes from the agency, and the way that it is presented is just, don't even get close to any of this. So
Discouraging.
yeah, there's
Right.
specific guidance that clearly tells people that water cooler discussion is permissible, as long as you're not
Right.
advocating for or against candidate A or B. But that's not how it comes across in this is what you need to know about the Hatch Act training. And then there's slightly different rules for union officials versus regular employees who aren't union officials. And so most employees end up taking overly cautious positions.
Right. Yeah, so Ian Hoffman actually says they can talk about legislation on federal property during their lunch hour and can even call their members of Congress on their own phone during that time. When they are off the clock and off federal property, they can meet with political representatives, attend rallies, volunteer on campaigns, and speak up about political issues. They are not allowed to solicit money for political candidates or represent their own views as the VAs. And, this is really important because there's like 300,000 people in the VA. I mean, imagine if 10% of them called their congresspeople. I mean, the other thing that I think we have to tell regular people outside of this room, because most of us really are familiar with this, but people don't think it matters if you call your congressperson, and they don't understand that actually it does. They take tics. They take, and the other thing they think is they don't think that they have to call their congressperson if their congressperson or senator is on their side. And that's really dumb, because they have to know that people are listening. And if they take stands like, 79 people, congresspeople and 5 senators voted against the Mission Act, those people need to hear from everybody and thank you for your service, you know what I mean?
Yes.
And we don't do that. It takes 5 minutes. And a lot of people go, I don't have to call Kamala Harris or Bernie Sanders or whatever. Well, you do.
They need you to.
Pardon?
They need you to.
They need you to. And so there's so much that we can do. And I mean, imagine if, all the people in this room called Tonko and Gillibrand who aren't veterans. And you specifically said, I'm not a veteran and I'm really upset about what's going on with what are you doing to our veterans? You know, imagine, and I mean, I tell you, I do it, you probably do it all the time, but I do it routinely, and literally I time it, you know, it takes 5 minutes, including looking up their phone number. I mean, people think you have to have this big spiel, you have to have a PhD in health policy. No, they don't, you know. I mean, you can organize meetings with them. And the other thing that's very important is that you meet with their staff too, because they all have a Veterans Affairs staff, right? They have a military legislative aid, MLA. Sadly, the MLAs don't know anything about healthcare, and the healthcare people don't know anything about the VA. So we play a big role in educating them. I don't want to keep people too much longer because
One more question.
One more question, and it's, you know, yes,
Brief
please.
question. The legislation that's been talked about that involves this, you know,
The Mission Act.
the backdoor privatization, it's called the Mission Act?
The VA Mission Act of 2018, so
Okay.
when you call, you want to say, I'm very concerned about the VA Mission Act of
Okay, thank you.
2018, and it's in caps. Mission is in caps. And if you want to buy my book, it's, it'll tell you everything about it. Yes.
What's your suggestion about, you know, about the stigma of the vets going to see a psychiatrist or a psychologist or a social worker? I think it's an endemic problem, and I'm a licensed clinical social worker. I have a private practice, and I moved down here recently, but I was up in Plattsburgh, New York for 8 years, a very isolated rural area, and a couple of young vets came to see me, and they absolutely refused to go and get services, even though it was so much better for them because there were groups, there were case managers, there was, you know, these whole treatment teams where I, you know, and I told them I can only do so much. I'm in private practice, but please go to the local VA because there's so much more, and I know the social workers there, and they really work hard, and they take groups out like to climb the Adirondack Mountains or the stress room. You know, I can't do that with you. So, you know, but there are vets who will suck up all the help they can get and go to other groups and get help. And then there are some who just are just adamant that, no, I don't want anybody to know, and I don't want them to know, and I didn't get help. And so my question is, with the stigma, what is needed? Because obviously there are people working in the VA that are working hard and they're encouraging people to come in. Where is the stigma coming from? Is it from, you know, military on the field, or where? And
Well, I mean, it's an endemic in our epidemic, endemic, whatever correct term, in the society in general. And then you get a bunch of guys, you know, who are, you know, from maybe have not, you know, difficult families or whatever, and they're re-socialized in the military. You know, they say, you know, they had somebody who said they had PTSD or mental health problem in the service, and they disappeared. That's, you know, they never heard, I mean, they were like there one day and gone the next, and the Army says it's trying to do something about this, but the VA, and it's in here, and I can't remember what it's called, and this is very important for you to refer people to, has a whole huge program of videos of vets speaking to vets, begging them to get help. 400 videos that they've done, and they're very powerful. And, you know, it takes, I mean, I think you have to play on the, you know, the sort of courage to heal, you know, it takes courage. No, it's not weakness, it takes courage. It's the I mean, you have to say this carefully, but, you know, it's a strength to be able to say, I need help, to say, you know, but I'd love to get your name because your name and contact, because you're absolutely right. A private practitioner cannot do, you can't teach them mindfulness meditation and yoga, and you don't have, you know, you haven't developed a killing scale to find out, you know, because they've discovered, for example, that some vets who are not successfully treated with prolonged exposure therapy and PT and cognitive behavioral therapy, it's often because they've killed someone. And not everybody in in combat actually has killed someone, right? And so vets who killed someone, they have a whole special killing scale and treatment, et cetera. Well, are you gonna have that? You know, I mean, it's,
I'm not special.
and I think it's really important I really applaud you, because I think it's really important for mental health practitioners to say that. I mean, I have spent time with a psychologist and a PT who work together, where you can find that in the private sector, and they take these vets to the park for treatment because they can't stand to be in a room. Well, I mean, can you take 2 hours and go to the park and walk around, you know, and build, I mean, so say, you know, we can do so much, but the VA can do so much more, but I want you to see this, you know, this program.
To your point, I think it's hard for non-veterans to understand the military's culture about not letting down your comrades,
Right,
not letting down the unit,
Right.
not messing with the mission.
right,
And I
exactly.
think the military course plays in that, tries to create that primary group identification.
Right.
Like it's us against death.
Yes,
Basically, it's us against the enemy. And it's forged then, I'm talking about my friend Steve, who's a Vietnam vet, who's now got 100% disability for his PTSD, that it's forged in this extreme danger. It's reinforced constantly and by other soldiers, by your comrades, and saying, come on, one more mile, you know, come on, one more
Right.
this, right? Jump out of a helicopter, as one of my younger veteran friends did, with all your Navy Corpsman gear on, and mess your back up, but that's what it takes to do the mission.
right.
So I think it would have to be veterans themselves. I don't really know, I'll refer to Adam in this. If somebody like you or me could make that contact and try to almost desensitize and almost like challenge that very, very strong military cultural, all right, stoicism and duty, and you know, doesn't matter if your foot's hurt, doesn't matter if you can't sleep, you gotta keep going. I don't know.
Well, I mean, I think it, oh, Adam, please.
I just, I know a lot of my friends who are veterans, a lot of them will not use the VA system for mental health conditions. And for most of them, it is because they are concerned that if they start talking to a government employee about the mental health conditions, then at some point the government is going to come for their guns. So some of them will, at their own cost, seek out non-government mental health providers as a way of decreasing the likelihood that the government finds out that they might have mental health issues. I don't know about, you know, your individual circumstances, but I do have a handful of friends that just will refuse to go to the VA for mental health things because they're worried about their Second Amendment, for better or for worse.
I think it's extremely tricky, and you almost have to use a technique called motivational interviewing to know how to, it's a big skill, you know. I mean, you can't just say you gotta go, you know, you have to have really certain kind of conversation that is very skilled conversation. I think you could probably get people to go, but you have to kind of tease out the reluctance, and, you know, then you have to say, well, so you're worried about they'll take away your guns, are you aware of that? I mean, you have to have a certain kind of very nuanced conversation. I mean, there's no way the government is gonna come take out their guns, they'll probably give them more, actually. But, you know, and I've been in situations, exact same situations, where, you know, a vet will go into the home and they'll say, you know, you need a social worker, and the guy will say, oh, if a social worker comes, they'll take away my benefits, and then you have to help them see that, no, that's not gonna happen. And actually, I mean, I am self-serving, I do want to sell my book, but there's a very good description about the very nuanced way the VA deals with guns. And they have a very good program about encouraging suicidal veterans to temporarily and voluntarily give their gun to someone else or separate their gun from the ammo of the gun, etc. But they will never take away your gun, ever. And it's tragic that, I mean, people don't get the help that they could get because they're suffering horribly, you know.
You just made me think of something. How many studies are done to compare the suicide rate or the or somebody going ballistic, shooting people out, to see how many people were treated in VA hospitals versus how many weren't?
Oh, they're not. They're not. Most of them aren't treated. And the guys who just, the guy in Thousand Oaks who killed 12 people, he was never went near VA. The guy in Yountville who killed 3 people, he was treated not in the VA but in a private program, and no fault of the program. I mean, some of these people are. I mean, the thing with all the 3 people this year that killed people was they should have never been taken into the military in the first place. They all had serious behavioral problems. They should have never been recruited. They should have never been accepted. They should have never been trained to kill, etc. Bad mistakes.
I met a guy on a bus in Albany a few years ago. I only talked to him for about 10 minutes. And he's about 2 or 3 years older than me, so he's like 66. And he said that he got arrested in Albany maybe around 1968, when he was maybe about 18 or 19. And he said he was a total fuck-up of a teenager. And one of the judges in Albany, either Harris or the other one,
Klein.
told him that you're either going to put you in prison or you need to go in the military. That was the choice he offered. So he didn't want to go to prison, so he joined the military, and then he was over to Vietnam, and he said there was a woman with a baby on the bus, and he was telling me, he said, when I was in Vietnam, I killed women and babies. He said, it's horrible. But I said, I was a total fuck-up. I should never have been in the military.
Right. Well, I just think that there's a lot actually that can be done with these veterans, but it's not, it's kind of like telling your wife if she's anxious, don't be anxious. I mean, you can't, that doesn't work very well. He tries it all the time. And it's never, it has only made me more anxious. Anyway, I would love to sign your books. I really thank you for coming. I hope you, thank Adam, thank John, and thank you for coming out on a not very nice night. And
Thank you.
Thank you.